My name is David Humphreys. I can't say I ever lived an eventful life. I came into this world in 1948, and I've simply been making my way ever since. It's 1984, and fate has decided that my time on this earth will be short-lived. So I make this final entry in my journal, recalling what little I can on my experience with what they now refer to as the dawn of the superheroes. They say World War II was the last great war. The last great patriotic war, anyway. Hitler invaded Poland in the pursuit of some grand scheme for global domination, and the whole damn world took him on. The philosophers and historians of the time said the end of the war would usher in a new era of peace and prosperity, that humanity would enter into what they called a golden age of enlightenment. It's kind of funny, because looking around right now, I don't think we ever got that far. My dad told me the first of these superpowered guys emerged in the 1940s. There was this robot, they called him the Human Torch. He could turn himself on fire.
The first ever to fly faster than the speed of sound.
There was a man from the seas named Namor who could fly, and of course, Captain America and Bucky Barnes. The papers always said we won the war because of Cap, but he gave the Allies something to rally behind. Dad said Cap and the invaders fought bravely enough during World War II, and him and the boys always loved seeing him in action. Dad would tell stories about how Cap was a deadeye with that shield. He'd throw them at the soldiers, taking out 3 or 4 at a time. Namor would throw the German tanks across the battlefield, and the Human Torch would rain down fire on everyone. I imagine it was probably an exciting thing to watch if you were one of the good guys, but if you were a German soldier, hell, you probably thought it was the end times. When the conflict ended, Dad made it back home to my mom in Detroit, and he got a job working at the factory helping to make cars. He worked there for 30 years, if you can believe it. They bought a house just outside the city, and I was born in 1948, so I was around 14 years old when all this superhero business started popping up again. The government kept talking about something called the space race, about how they wanted to beat the Russians to putting a man on the moon, but rumor has it that there was a scientist out in California who thought he could do better. They say he took a ship into space with his girlfriend, his best friend, and his girlfriend's brother, came back with all these crazy powers. The scientist could stretch. When I say stretch, I mean he could stretch everything. The girlfriend could make herself invisible. The best friend was some kind of giant rock monster. I don't know what to make of that. And the girlfriend's brother could set himself on fire just like the Human Torch from World War II that Dad used to tell me about. The news said they were hit with cosmic rays, whatever those are, and they started calling themselves the Fantastic Four. After this, all kinds of crazy stuff started happening. We were always glued to the television and reading the newspapers, waiting to see what happened next. Some scientist out in New Mexico was testing a new bomb, got caught in the blast, and everybody thought he died. Turns out he turned into something called the Incredible Hulk. Every time he picked up a paper or turned on the news, this Hulk fella was tearing the army to shreds. God help us if we ever end up going to war with him. There was a guy in New York calling himself Spider-Man. He dressed in this red and blue spandex. Local papers out there kept calling him a menace, but he sounded more like a crazy person to me. Then there was this giant man. He must have been around 2,000 feet tall when he attacked New York City. The news said he was accompanied by a man in silver. Mom and Dad wouldn't let me stay up to watch the whole event, but the next morning, newspaper said the Fantastic Four saved the city. And then there was this group called the X-Men. Nobody ever knew what the X stood for. I mean, hell, nobody ever knew anything about them. All we knew was that they just had these crazy powers. There was one guy who could shoot stuff out of his eyes that looked like red light. There was another who just kind of jumped around. One of them looked like a giant snowman, as crazy as that sounds, and another had wings, but I always thought the red-headed girl was pretty good looking. Never really knew what she could do. I always thought these people with powers were pretty cool. Me and my friends would run around outside when we were kids pretending to be some of them. Mom thought it was funny, but Dad kept talking about how they'd be the end of all of us. How humanity was following every last one of them on the road to perdition, as he would say. I was in high school when people started talking about Captain America coming back. There was this group calling themselves the Avengers, and rumor is one of them was an actual god, but Mom always said there was never but one god. But when I got home, me and my parents were watching the news when they said the Avengers had been on some mission and found Captain America frozen in ice. They thawed him out, and if you can believe it, 2 days later, he was back in business. Now, I don't think I'd ever seen my dad so excited. He started jumping around, talking about how Captain America would make the country great again, although I never really thought there was anything wrong with it in the first place. By the time I was a senior in high school, I had met a girl named Sarah. We had English together, and she had the most beautiful blonde hair you ever saw. Now, I never paid much mind to politics. Never really my thing, you understand? And Dad always taught me that a man need only worry about him and his, but because Sarah cared about politics, I guess that meant I had to care about politics too. At least if I wanted to take her out anyway. I'd watched the news enough to know about what was going on around the country, about the civil rights movement, about this superhero named Blue Marvel. They said he'd been done wrong by the federal government. I kept telling Sarah that a lot of people had been done wrong by the federal government, but she kept saying that this was different. That the government was doing some really bad things. She kept talking about a man named Senator Robert Kelly and something about Project Wide Awake. So the government was afraid the mutants would take over the country, so they wanted to find a way to keep them in check. Supposedly Sarah was going off on some campaign to help restore mutant rights, but I never really found out what happened to her. Looking at the state of things, I don't know if she ever succeeded. Truth to tell, we had a few mutants living around the neighborhood, but Mom and Dad would never let me spend any time with them. They kept saying the mutants were dangerous, and hell, I couldn't blame them for being scared. The news would report on stories about the mutants. Terrible stories they were, about a guy who could control metal, people who could turn into anyone, and even some who could move things around with their minds. Dad said the mutants would be the end of us all, that one of them might decide to assassinate the president, maybe impersonate the president, and launch nukes at the Russians, starting World War III. None of the mutants I knew ever seemed to be that bad, I guess, but I guess it made sense there'd be a few of them who did bad things. One of these mutants, calling himself Magneto, he set up on an asteroid orbiting Earth and started calling himself the savior of mutant kind, as crazy as that sounds. He invaded a missile base in Florida called Cape Citadel and tried to detonate all the missiles, but the X-Men beat him. The way I figure it, if they were fighting the bad guys, then they must have been the good guys. But Mom and Dad just kept saying they were all dangerous. For all this concern about what the news called the mutant menace, Mom and Dad kept going about their normal lives. Maybe it was a thought of killing all them Germans during World War II. Maybe it was because of Mom, I have no idea. But what I know is that once he got back from the war, Dad found God and drug us to church every Sunday. Pastor Stevens would give these sermons about God punishing the wicked and that his rightful judgment was close at hand. A few times he had this televangelist named Reverend William Stryker offer his own sermons. I don't know, maybe Pastor Stevens was trying to make the church more popular, but most folks in the congregation felt uncomfortable listening to Reverend Stryker talk about purifying the earth and carrying out God's judgment on the impure mutants, but some enjoyed it. They'd shout things like, "Adam and Eve were humans, not mutants." Rumor has it that Reverend Stryker formed a group called the Purifiers and started running around the country killing mutants wherever he found them, but I don't know if any of that's true. Back in 1974, when I was in college, the whole world seemed to stand still. The news was broadcasting a fight between the Avengers and a man who I can only describe as giant and purple with a wrinkly chin. The battle looked like one of the most fierce things I'd ever seen, but halfway through, all the Avengers and this giant purple guy took off into space. Well, it's anybody's guess whatever happened to him after that. Looking around this world, some might say we achieved the higher enlightenment people were looking for. The world's becoming more technologically advanced every day, but by and by, with all these superheroes flying around, fighting bad guys and tearing cities apart, sometimes I can't help but wonder where the world went. At times, I feel like this is all a dream, that I'll wake up with Sarah, a couple of kids, and a picket fence. But sometimes I think maybe this is as good as it gets. Maybe the world will regain its mind one day. I have no idea. All I know is that I won't be here to see it.